This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today my guest is Mark Montgomery, the Senior Director of the Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation and a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. In addition to his 32-year career in the Navy, Admiral Montgomery previously served as the Policy Director of the Senate Armed Services Committee for Senator John McCain. Admiral Montgomery joins us today to discuss recent developments in Ukraine and how the country has adapted to shifting U.S. policies and challenges on the ground. Stay with us as we speak with Admiral Mark Montgomery. Mark Montgomery, welcome back to NatSec Matters.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, Michael.
So glad to have you. We've got plenty to talk about, but let's begin with Ukraine. I think you're just back from an education mission. What did you do while you were in Ukraine? And tell us a little bit about these increasing attacks, seemingly with cruise missiles, drones, and ballistic missiles that seem to be greater and greater as each day ends.
Yeah, thanks for asking. And you're exactly right. I just got back. I'm with a nonprofit there. We do pro bono work, a few general officers along with some field grade officers like colonels and majors that work with their with the general staff and the Ministry of Defense, and then go down to subordinate units like the Air Force detachment, the F-16 detachments, corps level command, naval units, and do education on Western, tactics, the use of Western equipment, how you organize yourself, Western doctrine, and for the use of the tools that we've given them over the last 3 years. We provided Ukraine with $30 billion plus worth of U.S. gear through sales or grants. In addition, the Europeans have provided another $30 billion worth of gear that includes, in fact, even more than that, the majority of which is American. So they have all this American equipment. They get hands-on training in Poland or Germany, but and in the case of the F-16 pilots in Arizona, but for the most part, their kind of senior officers are not given that kind of training that I got as an admiral over like 30 years of training in the military about how to properly use the joint force, how to properly integrate different parts of the Navy or a general with different parts of the Army and the Air Force. So we kind of try to fill that gap a little bit. And so I got a good opportunity to see F-16 units, corps level command headquarters, smaller level units, and in the past, maritime units.
Okay, Mark, let's talk a little bit about the war. It seems that the Russians, I think it's fair to say, recently were making incremental but not decisive progress. I'm sort of reading news accounts and accounts from the region. The Russians seem to be doing a little bit worse of late. Do I have that right? Kind of give us a status on where the war stands.
I like your description, very tactically at this moment. And here's what I would say. The Ukrainians are not going to lose this fight. Talking with their senior leaders, talking with their corps commanders, their brigade commanders, they're not. I mean, they're going to take a beating and they're not going to lose. Now, that doesn't mean they're able to physically eject Russia from the parts of Ukraine they occupy, including Crimea right now. But they're not going to lose. Putin is on a Sisyphean task of killing a generation of Russian youth. 1,500 casualties a day at a time. Those aren't all deaths, but deaths, injuries, prisoners. Putin is not going to win. The Ukrainians are not going to buckle, and the Ukrainians believe their societal resilience will eventually outlast Russia's. They don't lowball Russia's societal resilience. They think it's high as well, but they believe that they don't believe they're going to collapse, and I don't believe they are. And and as a result, I believe we need to provide them with the equipment and the manpower and the munitions that they need to minimize the casualties as they don't lose.
Yeah,
and that's the key element right now. That's the key decision-making process for the president.
All right. Well, let's come back to that in just a second. So they're not going to lose, but they might take a beating. What underpins that? The presumption that we, the United States, keep sending military assistance at some level?
I think two things underpin it. First, that we continue to provide intelligence and warning so that they can respond with agility to Russian actions. That's just something uniquely we have. The Europeans can't replace it. It's just something the U.S. is very good at. We provide that for all our allies, for NATO, for Japan, for Korea. We provide that kind of overhead imagery that supports high quality intelligence and warning from NGA and defense and other intelligence agencies. That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, we have to keep our defense industrial base open to purchases or grants for Ukraine, and we can determine how they do it. But either so Ukraine can purchase things, Europe can purchase things on behalf of Ukraine, Europe can purchase things on behalf of Ukraine with Russian money, frozen Russian assets, or if Donald Trump really turns a corner, the United States can provide it to Ukraine. But in any case, too many of their systems in the field that really need munitions, NASAMS, which is an air defense system, needs the AMRAAM missile. Patriot, which is an air defense system, needs the PAC missile. And they need 155 still. And they need a few other, I don't want to sell it short, there's other calibers of munitions that they need.
Okay. So embedded in the idea of grants is exactly what? Do we need to continue? Here's what I like to say. We're not going to get back to the days of $61 billion of appropriations, but we need to keep some basic level of military assistance, at least until the Europeans step up. Is that a acceptable formulation, or what do you think?
Yeah, and I'll be honest here. This is at least until the war ends, because the Europeans can't step up. But by step up, the Europeans can give money, but they can't build a defense industrial base in less than 15 or 20 years. So we have to leave the DIB open for sales, for purchase, the U.S. defense industrial base. And then you're right, on the grants, I would probably go the Lindsey Graham way and say loans. Maybe it's loans against the critical mineral deal eventual profits.
Yeah.
Now, here's why it's important that America do it, because we're the only ones that can really do the equivalent of presidential drawdown authority. At this point, the European allies have given away the on-hand munitions down to their minimums. The Estonians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, have given that away. So the only person who can provide a PAC missile or a AMRAAM missile or 155 kind of fluidly, almost immediately, would be the U.S. from Presidential Drawdown Authority. So I would use a loan program against PDA. So you have to pay us back in cash over time, but we give you this equipment. Honestly, the Biden administration should have done this in their last package and set up a program of loans because, I think there's a presumption of winning the election. And as a result, we're basically in the most unappealing. The only process that exists for the president right now is the one that was least appealing to him. And that's unfortunate.
So a few years ago, I wrote an article with Connor Pfeiffer, and I remember interviewing you for it. And it was essentially that we can still help Taiwan. We don't have to mortgage the defense and deterrence of China because these wars are fundamentally different wars. And there are a lot of ammunition and munitions that are only used in one theater and not the other. But there were a couple of areas of overlap, and if there's overlap, let's send it to Taiwan. Does that still hold true? And I think in the middle there, it was some of the Patriot missile batteries and sort of breakdown. Are we able to do both of these?
So yes, we are. There are points of friction. So here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Brad Bowman and Ryan Brost have produced a monograph called Arsenal of Democracy, which goes through the 26 most important pieces of ammunition, kind of ones you'd recognize, between Taiwan, Israel's demand from us, and Ukraine's demand from us. And the answer across the swath of them was, we can provide what everybody needs. Now, I would say there's becoming pressure points there in the Patriots. That I will say this about Taiwan Patriots. I think that's a high-end, expensive weapon system because they buy them. and they are going to be heavily targeted. But I would still purchase them if I were the Taiwans. I would, for specific areas of defense to try to preserve their resilience for as long as possible. My point on this is, I think the Patriot missiles are an issue, but most of the other things each one needed. The most important things for our fight with Taiwan at 3 or 4 years ago was the long-range anti-ship cruise missile. Not relevant to, that was our worst munition case.
Mm-hmm.
The SM-6. The SM-2, these are standard missiles fired from Navy ships. The missiles that go into the Army's PrSM, their precision strike that they were building. The weapons that go into the Marine Corps' Nemesis, its anti-ship weapon. The weapons we sell to Taiwan, Harpoon. These were not conflicts with Ukraine or Israel. So we could do that. The most important weapons that each one needed were slightly different.
Okay.
It was ground forces stuff in Ukraine, anti-ship and mining stuff for Taiwan, and air-to-ground delivered stuff for Israel. It was literally, I'm not saying, we got a little lucky, and you could do them. Look, the real issue in that report is the crap condition of the defense industrial base in terms of its ability to go to production, and I don't blame the companies for that.
Right.
I blame Congressional Department of Defense officials like you and me who did not spend enough on munitions in the 2000s and 2010s and allowed our defense industrial base to wither.
Understood. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what else you learned on the ground there. Your contention is that the Ukrainians are not going to lose this war. The Russians aren't going to win it, and that's great to hear. What else did you learn just about the battle? And just to get you started off here, I don't totally understand. I guess they're trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people by continuing to target apartment buildings and the rest. But it seems to me that's sort of a waste of ammunition. Why aren't the Russians more interested in expending their munitions on military targets instead of trying to kill civilians all the time?
So that's a good question, a good insight. I think part of this is how Ukraine deploys its defensive systems. In the end, they defend their counter targeting, their military bases and military systems first. And they don't conserve weapons on that. They will defend those F-16 bases. They will defend their, defense industrial base production facilities. And in the end, there's a wide swath of Ukraine that are undefended from cruise and ballistic missile attack. So if Russia decides, and they're basically civilian infrastructure and civilian housing, and the Russians strike them once in a while. I just don't think Putin, I think we can agree he's a war criminal, and I don't think collateral damage is part of his, civilian collateral damage is part of his calculation. So I think it's a mixture of what he's willing to attack and what Ukraine's willing to defend. So, and then, by the way, the defended, I imagine if we don't get them Patriots and AMRAAMs, they're going to conserve more and more, of those weapon systems. And they have a very limited French system and Iris missiles and things like that. But the reality is, if we don't pass them Patriots and NASAMS, they will have to conserve them. And when they conserve them, they will defend less things and more civilians will be killed.
Understood. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Russian war strategy. I'm sure you talked about it a great deal with Ukrainian military officials. As best I can tell from all the expert commentary, the Russians are still in this meat grinder mode where they send poorly trained young privates, if you will, on enormous runs across the battlefield to try and make trench by trench progress for the Russians. Is that accurate still? And if so, why such an unsophisticated strategy?
Well, I think that's part of it. I also think there's some sophistication in the sense of what they try to grab in terms of giving them leverage to grab, to capture some specific towns in eastern Ukraine that they're targeting. So some of it is unsophisticated, some of it is meat grinder, and some of it is a very specific effort to seize valuable ground for a larger offensive. In other words, you'll be on the right side of the correct side of the river be in the correct, position for initiating an offensive strike. So they are trying to grab specific swaths of land, these very small, like square kilometer by square kilometer gains they've had, at the expense of hundreds of troops. And look, are they still practicing meat grinder tactics? Absolutely. And, more and more people are being killed. I think the last number, and you probably have seen this, is 72% of battlefield casualties, Russian battlefield casualties, are caused by Ukrainian drones or mine drones, which are drones that have landed and then act like a mine when a person or piece of gear gets within range of it. That's a really high percentage, much higher than 8, 9, or 12 months ago, and much higher than one would have certainly than we would have expected 2 years ago. My point on this is, yes, there's a meat grinder aspect to it, but there is some operational thought about the land they're trying to grab, and I think it has to do with a potential summer offensive. We'll have to see. Unless there's their use of glide bombs has now been understood, which, by the way, when they call them glide bombs, you and I would call them crappy JDAMs, right? But their use of them was a short-term game changer, 9 months ago. But the Ukrainians have figured out how to counter them, how to impact the aircraft delivering them, how to impact the drones themselves, how to minimize the damage from them. So, you know what I mean? Every time there's this adaptive warfare going on, which the Ukrainians are very good at.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm not sure we'd be this good at it. I hope so, but I'm not sure so.
So I was going to ask you about the summer offensive. I'm continuing to hear about this, that the Russians may try and mount one. Do you think that's the case?
I think they're going to try to seize specific towns. I don't want to call them cities, but and they're not really occupied anymore. We're barely occupied locations. And honestly, I don't know what the goal is here, unless it's trade space. It's part of a negotiation, which I don't see Putin entering. Right. So he may be waiting for the end of this offensive. I also think I'm very confident Putin does not get accurate field information from the field, because he is well known to not take bad news well, right? So I don't know that it's being communicated to him the degree to which this is a Sisyphean task.
So I remember last summer, was it Kherson? There was another attempt to manufacture, if you will, some sort of mass troop movement in order to take more territory, and it failed spectacularly. Is there any reason to believe it's going to succeed this time?
The only way it would have a better chance is if the U.S. cut off intel sharing.
Okay.
And the Ukrainians didn't have... They're starting to get good enough a surveillance and reconnaissance network of their own with drones that at a tactical level, I don't think surprise would happen. But operational level surprise would be bad. From my perspective, that we're the ones who prevent that operational level surprise.
Okay. And you were just there, of course. How would you assess Ukrainian morale?
It's dogged, persistent. It's there's a sense of like this is going to be inevitably painful, but in the end, they're not going to capitulate. Look, I spend part of my time, and they willingly commit their time to thinking about what it takes to get Ukraine's military into NATO and into Western organizations. And there's this underlying problem and people like me who are the UCOM J5 and Ben Hodge, all of us that worked with them in the 2010s, we did not do good enough a job breaking them of their Soviet legacy ligature.
Yeah.
In their judicial system, their military judicial system, in their military training system, in their recruiting system, in their procurement system. Now, their procurement system has evolved aggressively because of the war, but the other ones have not, and we need to help them. If there's ever an opportunity for them to join, to be more integrated with Western military alliances, whether it's NATO or something else, they're going to really have to de-Sovietize, and I don't know if that's a word, but it should be, some of their systems. And look, I helped a bunch of former Warsaw Pact and former SSR, Soviet Socialist Republics, get through the NATO MAP process. That's the military accession plan. It normally takes 7 to 10 years to break you of these bad habits and to get everything aligned properly. It's almost like an EU 24 chapter package. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're going to have to do that with theirs. But this is the optimism they have. They're spending bandwidth on that. That's, to me, the day they say to me, we don't want to talk about that anymore. We're only going to deal with the wolf closest to the sled. That's when I start to worry. But they're dealing with everything. And that tells me that they have optimism.
All right, so let's go back to the battlefield. We've talked about what we believe to be the Russian strategy. What's the Ukrainian strategy? Is it just to play defense? I know they at one point did the Kursk incursion, which all signs point to that was going to be trade space if they ever got to negotiations. But what's their strategy if there is one?
Well, look, I think first and foremost, they have to be incredibly effective defenders.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, I think we're in this, we're in this competition between three sets of resilience: Ukrainian resilience, societal resilience, Russian societal resilience, and Western societal resilience. And, which one's going to break first? And, Donald Trump's not helping too much with that Western one right now, but ours has got the least load on it, the Western one. To me, Ukraine just has to outsurvive Russia. I think that's I would be very careful. What I would do is take advantage of, now that if they use the F-16s properly, F-16s plus drones could punch holes through Russian air defense systems and allow significant damage to Russian aggregated units and logistics units and command and control units. And I think, so if I were the Ukrainians, and I hope this is what they're going to do, is you broadly play defense, take advantage of the inherent value of being on the defense, and then counterpunch. Not seizing Kursk, counterpunch. Counterpunch in their aggregated units, counterpunch in their command and control, hit their senior officers, hit their logistics trains, make this war really, financially debilitating, even more financially debilitating to Putin. Because if we hit those things, you really put a burden on cost on them. There are limitations to the Russian defense industrial base.
Yeah, that's for sure. And so I've noticed that the Ukrainians seem to want to counterpunch where they can, and they've been complaining for years that there were too many restrictions on what the Western nations would allow their munitions to be used for. And so here we are, the day after Labor Day, and it appears that the Germans, at least, and other Europeans have removed all their restrictions on whether their weapons and missiles or cruise missiles or whatever the case may be can be used to range into Russia. Does this seem significant, is it?
When combined with U.S. imagery and their own imagery now, I think the Ukrainians could do real damage. This was what was missing 18 months ago when we first passed ATACMS.
Yeah.
That's another one. The ATACMS, the U.S. long range, 300 kilometer plus, artillery round, effectively, could really do damage. I mean, it's more than a normal artillery round, but it could do real damage to the adversary when allowed to be used at maximum range and maximum effectiveness. But by the way, we should give them more. I think we built 6,600. We probably used 1,000 in combat. I don't know why, in Iraq, Afghanistan, but also testing and training and things like that. We've given them a handful. We should give them more, and we should give them more with the same, no restrictions that the Europeans are giving them. If we did that, that would be a significant counterpunch tool. When combined with the F-16s, it could really open up holes in Russian logistics and command and control, and aggregate it. It'll make it very hard for the Russians to aggregate their forces in a way they've become accustomed to. So I'm really glad the Germans did this. I'm really glad the Europeans are doing it broadly, if they are. I've only seen the German comment, but that to me is a helpful event in this counterpunch.
We're going to take a quick break. and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Admiral Montgomery.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Okay, before we go to the topic of President Trump's efforts to broker peace, one last question on the battlefield situation. I've read over and over again, of course, that drones have reshaped warfare. I've read about the jamming of a variety of drones and that the Russians are now using fiber optic cable to guide their drones as they head towards Ukraine. I've also read that you can't really aggregate troops because a drone will hit them. What's your sense of how drones are affecting the battlefield situation today?
Well, I think you have to look at that geographically, like within 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 50 kilometers. It has an increasingly focusing effect the tighter you are. And the percentage of casualties are inflicted by drones are much higher in those areas. Once you get to less than 1 kilometer, then there's other things that kill people, like weapons. But the drones. So from that perspective, the drones are playing it. And it's the surveillance reconnaissance drones. It's the one-way strike drones. It's the very long-range strike drones that they've used into Russia to some effect on the Russian oil and refinery systems on occasion. So from my perspective, they have had this a very jarring effect on the battlefield. A couple thoughts, though. One, this is in the context of no one has air power. So I'm not 100% sure that all these lessons are applicable, even in ground combat, and when conducted between, say, with the United States involved. Still have an impact, but it may not be as decisive. But I think there's out at sea, the performance of the unmanned surface vessels. I think I've said this before that the Ukrainian Navy of 2023 and 2024 had the best 2 years any Navy's ever had without getting a ship underway. It's an amazing thing. They've pinned the Russian Navy back to its Black Sea ports alongside Georgia, and they've prevented any kind of amphibious feint or assault. They've sunk the flagship, and a number they've damaged. 12 or 13 other reasonable sized ships. So, including a submarine. So my point, my perspective is drones have made a big difference. They're making a difference on this battlefield. We should be learning a lot of lessons from this. I don't think we're getting them at quite the core level we normally would when a partner's using our systems in combat. We're not getting the lessons learned that we would normally get from that fed back into our system at the level of detail we would normally get. But this really is an interesting aspect of the fight, and I do think they're an important part of it. And I only know the Ukrainian production rate. It's phenomenal what they're producing every month. They have battalions assigned to brigades, and the battalion's job, and some of the brigades have this, is to build drones. Yeah. They literally bring like a mini defense industrial base with the brigade, and they're building drones. So pretty cool. A lot being learned there, and the level of adaptation that the Ukrainians have taken to is impressive. And on the other side, the Russians have either mimicked well or on occasion creatively developed their own ideas pretty well.
Okay, fascinating. We've got a lot to learn from the Ukrainians here. All right, so President Trump has tried to get a ceasefire agreed to. The Ukrainians agreed to it basically without conditions. The Russians had many conditions to even sit down or even agree to a ceasefire, including that the Ukrainians should transfer territory over to formal Russian control that had not been taken, had not been conquered. And that was just, of course, I think, a bridge too far for the Ukrainians. And from what I gather, the administration even understood that. So the president, I think, is getting rightfully frustrated with Vladimir Putin. He's criticized him in the last couple of weeks, but he definitely did over this weekend. Mark, what do you assess to be Putin's strategy? Is he... Go ahead. Well, I don't want to lead the witness, if you will. What do you think Putin's game is?
I can be led. So listen. First of all, Putin couldn't have played his hand worse here. I mean, he had Donald Trump placing a maximum pressure campaign on Zelensky, and successfully, as you said, getting Zelensky, qualifier free to the table, with some implied concessions that were pretty heavy. And then Putin insists on demilitarizing Ukraine so that at a later date he could come back and do whatever he wanted. He insists, as you said, on the transfer of territory not held. He insisted on the recognition of territory that was illegally occupied, which was just not even a country can't even do that. And so all these, you're absolutely right. Putin was over the top in this, and I don't know that. I mean, there's a presumption on his part of President Trump's complicity that I think was not right. I hope was not right. We'll see over the next 2 weeks, because this is the third time President Trump has said enough, and I'm going to do something if you keep this up, and Putin's kept it up. So I don't know if Trump's gaslighting us, or he's actually going to come and drop the hammer on Putin. It's easy to drop the hammer on Russia. We don't even need to pass the law. The sanctions bills that are in the Senate and House are nice.
Yeah.
But he has the power right now to squeeze the Russian economy in painful ways, with secondary and tertiary sanctions on shadow fleet ships that would cause China and India to back off purchasing Russian oil.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but then I want you to go back to that chain of command. But why do you really believe the Chinese would give up purchasing oil at such an advantage?
The Chinese companies involved in this, the sanctions would prevent them from being able to do trading. I think it would have implications on their ability to participate in SWIFT. It would create problems for them with any kind of foreign direct investment they've done in countries that are compliant with us. Mm-hmm. In other words, the question isn't, do you want to help Russia? The question is, do you want to, if you're a Chinese, company, even a state-owned enterprise, and certainly the Indians as well, do you want to get cross-threaded with the United States sanctions regime?
Yeah.
And the answer to most places is no, I don't.
Right. I always just thought the Chinese, though, looked at some of these companies, teapot refineries, whatever, and said, these are not state entities.
They're expendable.
They're expendable. Who cares? All right. So I derailed you. Tell us again, in addition to what we just discussed, why is it so easy? Why are some of these sanctions a great way to get Putin's attention?
From my perspective, I think 40+% of the Russian economy is fueled by the sale of these resources, right? Oil, natural gas, and then the Russian government itself runs on the income from that, and this number is pretty solid. Like 43% of federal government spending in Russia is on the military. So there's this direct chain. If I can squeeze the value of the input into the Russian economy from the sale of oil and natural gas, I can give Putin a strategic dilemma. Do you pay for the military, or do you pay for the rest of the federal budget? A lot of which is payments to, I like to say payments to babushkas. It's more than that, but it's payments to the base. So who does Putin want to serve? The military, which is conducting this war, or his base, which is his regime credibility? So you put pressure on him that way. And look, you've got to do it to the secondary and tertiary, the receivers of the shadow fleet, because the Europeans are about to lower the G7, how much you can get, what's the limit on paying for Russian oil and natural gas, dropping it from 60 to a lower number, I think in the mid 40s, that only has effect if Russia can't sell it to China and Iran, who ignore that price, that price limitation.
I see. So new downward pressure or adjusting downward the price cap. All right. So what does a successful negotiation look like anyway? I mean, are the Russians really, do they need a ceasefire? Put it that way. Let's start there.
Well, I mean, I don't know that they need a ceasefire. I don't know that Putin knows they need a ceasefire, but I mean, there is a limit to how much they can do this. I think that Russia's a tough country. I lived in the Soviet Union for 3 years as a teenager. I mean, I get that they're resilient in a way American population could never be resilient. What they're willing to accept is much harsher. And support for Putin is not, he is not a tin pot dictator. Support's legitimate for him. And skepticism and suspicion of the United States and the West is genuinely high in the Russian population. I think those are facts that are hard to deal with in this case. But eventually, Russian resilience, as the deaths turn from like Russian minorities and prisoners to Slavic Russian kids, from St. Petersburg and Moscow, I think pressure will build on Putin. So I do think there are internal things that will eventually squeeze the Russians. The external things are the things we can do now. That's the oil and natural gas. By the way, that's also providing like ATACMS. Just if the president said, you know what, I'm going to give them 1,000 ATACMS unrestricted. That would be a strong signal to Putin. Get to the table, because every one of those ATACMS is going to hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Now that if they could use good, time-sensitive U.S. targeting, unrestricted geographic usage, probably not Belarus, but anywhere else. Hey, that's a pretty significant tool. So there are things we could do to bring Putin to try to bring Putin to the table. In the end, I can't guarantee you Putin's coming to anyone who, I haven't looked into his eyes and assessed his soul, and so I'm not 100% sure.
You're cold. That's cold.
What he's going to do. So I would just say we've misjudged Putin a lot. From that comment I had on George Bush, but also George W., but also the reset button from Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. We have misjudged him repeatedly. I think the president's misjudging him now.
All right, as we begin to wrap up here, let me ask you first, do the Ukrainians need a ceasefire? Are they exhausted? You talk about societal resilience. If somehow Russia agreed to an unconditional ceasefire, was that good news for Ukraine? Tell us about
it. It's good news only if the rule set of the ceasefire is such that they can rearm, reset, continue to militarize themselves, be in a successful military position. They cannot accept a ceasefire where they're frozen in place, and Russia says they're frozen in place and then does whatever they want. Because if we know one thing about Russia, whether we're talking about, every treaty we've done with the former Soviet Union and the Russians, they violate it. They violated the hell out of the intermediate, the one you can look at with Putin is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, where he was clearly building hypersonic weapons in violation of it for a decade. So why we would trust him on this is zero. So I would assume both sides can remilitarize so that the Ukrainians can. Because if you say you're not gonna, only one side will remilitarize. So the answer is yes, they would benefit from it, but it has to be an acceptable set of terms. And President Trump, in his rush to get, if he gets some concession from Putin, needs to be very careful that he does not further pressure Ukraine into unacceptable concessions. And that is his trademark. I mean, this has not been the art of the deal for the last 3 months.
Okay. Let me ask you the big question here. Is the only way that this war ends is with Vladimir Putin out of office?
Yes. And the reason I say that is this war didn't start in February of 2022. This war started in 2014. They were in a long, after the illegal annexation of Crimea and portions of Donbass, there was a 8-year It wasn't a frozen conflict. There was an 8-year simmering conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine that broke out into the open in February of 2022 when Putin falsely believed he could seize Ukraine with his large-scale maneuver army, which was a short-range maneuver army in the end, and he couldn't do it. So the answer is yes, in the end. And I'm not sure, and I'd go further than Putin. I would say Putin and any successor who believes in the annexation of Ukraine, which is effectively what Putin believes in.
Mark, if we only have a ceasefire, and that's hard enough to get to, but let's say President Trump gets there. If the war is going to continue almost under any scenario where Vladimir Putin is still the ruler of Russia, I assume you believe we will never get beyond the ceasefire to a comprehensive peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, Michael, that is the big question. That's a good question. It is. I don't believe that. I mean, I believe that a ceasefire is possible, and a ceasefire will allow both sides to rearm, to recover, to build their resilience back. But it won't end this crisis. This crisis is driven by a fundamental disagreement between Russia and Ukraine. Russia believes Ukraine is part of a greater Russia. Ukraine believes it's an independent European state that would like to be in the European Union and NATO, and that is in direct conflict. Those two theories are in direct conflict with each other, and they won't resolve till one set of leadership is gone.
Okay, so I think there it is. At best, we believe President Trump could get a ceasefire, but to really bring it to a comprehensive peace agreement and end the war is really, really hard to foresee this happening.
I agree. I would say impossible.
All right. Mark Montgomery, thank you so much. You're one of the more popular guests on NatSec Matters, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
That was Admiral Montgomery. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please rate and review the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.